Good evening, everybody. Good evening to those of you here and those of you online. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amir Pasek. I'm the Eugene R. Temple Dean of the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. Welcome to the 19th Annual Thomas H. Lake Lecture. The Lake Lecture is a highlight of our academic year. It draws attention to exceptional work in the field that is nurtured by the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. Tonight, we are honored that Dr. Susannah Heschel is with us. I want to welcome all of you who are assembled with us, whatever format you are in, and there's many more of you online there is in person, and plus it's a very nice day, so special thanks of you to who did show up. I'm also so pleased that we have our students here from our BA, our master's, our PhD, and our new professional doctorate in philanthropic leadership as well. I also want to thank our alumni for joining us, and I want to welcome members of our Board of Visitors and the Lake Institute Board of Advisors. Earlier this evening, we hosted a small reception for members of our 2013 Founders Society, the Rosso Giving Society, and the Dean's Circle members. Your contributions to the school enable us to continue groundbreaking research and to positively impact the field of philanthropy. When you see the headlines today, I would not blame you for forgetting what it is that a university is here to do, and we are here to seek understanding. This occasion hopefully should remind us why we create these communities of discovery, where we join our curiosity with each other in dialogue. We are grateful to Dr. Heschel for capturing our imaginations and bringing us together this evening. Her act of generosity toward our community echoes the role of generosity in the process of seeking understanding, and I thank all of you assembled with us for sharing your curiosity with us. As we anticipate our journey of discovery with Dr. Heschel, let us also pause to recognize the generous donor without whose gift we would not be here tonight. We all share the good fortune of benefiting this evening from the vision of Karen Lake Buttry. In 2002, she designated a bequest from her parents' estate to Indiana University to establish the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, which honors the legacy of the Lakes by exploring the dynamic relationship between faith and giving through research, education, and training. In addition, the annual Thomas H. Lake Lecture was established to bring renowned speakers to Indianapolis to promote greater understanding at the intersections of faith and giving. I am grateful to be participating with you in this vital legacy of inspiration and understanding. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce my good colleague, Dr. David King, the Karen Lake Buttry Director of Lake Institute on Faith and Giving and Associate Professor of Philanthropic Studies. An award-winning scholar, teacher, and public intellectual, Professor King has written a terrific book about world vision, run major research projects to understand congregational dynamics, and engage students, practitioners, and the media to deepen understanding of the connections between religion and philanthropy. Please join me in welcoming David King to begin our program.
Thank you, Amir. As the Karen Lake Buttry Director of the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, it's my pleasure to add my welcome to you with Dean's Passage for this, our 19th annual Thomas H. Lake Lecture. And as Amir said, this lecture really is a highlight of our year. Our gathering this evening would not have been possible without the example of Tom and Marjorie Lake and the philanthropic generosity in their honor by Karen Lake Buttry and Donald Buttry. The Lake and Buttry families have helped instill a legacy of thoughtful reflection about the ways in which faith inspires and informs giving toward what I hope will continue to shape our mutual understanding and practice as we seek the flourishing of our communities wherever we might find ourselves. We're so delighted to host this in-person event here in our local Indianapolis community, but we're also grateful and so many of you are joining this conversation online from wherever you find yourselves. And we hope that you'll feel free to follow up with us at Lake Institute and at the School of Philanthropy. Please let's find ways to connect around this mutual work. We would love to work together to address these complex but so vital questions around the intersections of faith and philanthropy. And on that note, I have the distinct privilege of introducing Dr. Susannah Heschel, who will address us this evening as our Thomas H. Lake Lecturer. Professor Heschel serves as the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies Program at Dartmouth College. And while her scholarly interests are quite broad, she's particularly focused on the history of Jewish and Protestant religious thought in Germany during the 19th and 20th centuries, including the history of biblical scholarship, Jewish scholarship on Islam, and the history of anti-Semitism. She's the author of multiple books, such as Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians, and the Bible in Nazi Germany. And she's the author of over 100 articles. And has also edited several books, including Muslim Responses to European Orientalism, Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, the essays of Abraham Joshua Heschel, Betrayal, German Churches and the Holocaust, and Insider Outsider, American Jews and Multiculturalism. Forthcoming this year is a monograph written with our IU Bloomington colleague Sarah Imhoff on Jewish studies and the woman question. She's the recipient of 5 honorary doctorates from universities in the US, Canada, Germany, and Switzerland. And she's held fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and fellowships at the National Humanities Center and the Maimonides Institute in Hamburg. She served as a Guggenheim Fellow and serves on the Academic Advisory Council of the Center for Jewish Studies in Berlin, and serves on the Board of Trustees at Trinity College. Now, in addition to all these academic accomplishments and honors, it's worth noting that over this past year, she's also served as a leading voice in articulating a way forward and communicating across our religious differences for mutual understanding and engagement. She's been a leader on her own campus at Dartmouth and has shared her perspective through outlets such as PBS NewsHour and NPR, both here in the US and also around the world. And with this attention to the ways that our religious traditions can lead to deep reflection within our communities, as well as exhibiting ways in which we can connect across our distinct traditions, I cannot think of anyone better to address us this evening as our Thomas H. Lake Lecturer than Dr. Heschel. The title of her lecture, again, Generosity of Spirit, Exploring Jewish Traditions and Relational Philanthropy. Please help us welcome Professor Heschel.
Thank you so much, David King and Dean Amir Pasek, for this wonderful introduction and for the reception today with the students who have been really fantastic interlocutors all day. I've enjoyed so much being here. And of course, I love being in Indianapolis. It's a wonderful city. You have also, this is a great place, a marvelous campus of the university, and you have a fantastic airport. I really love your airport. But I want to thank you for inviting me to speak today, and I'm happy also to be here with old friends, Rabbi Dennis Sasso and Rabbi Sandy Sasso. It's great to be with you. And I want to thank the School of Philanthropy and the Lake Buttrey family for their endowment of this lectureship in honor of Thomas H. Lake. And I also thank the Lilly Foundation for all that you do here for the School of Philanthropy and for all of us in the field of religious studies. I thank you too because the fellowship that I received from the Lilly Foundation many years ago led me to develop a course. It was for developing a course on religion and the environment. And I needed a mentor. That was part of the requirement of the grant. And that's how I met my husband. And so we lived happily ever after, thanks to the Lilly Foundation. So this question of philanthropy in Jewish tradition has been a stimulating one, and I thank David King for asking me to talk about it, because it has led me to some very new and interesting texts in Jewish thought that I find quite stimulating. We know that philanthropy is love of human beings, but in Jewish tradition, loving human beings means loving God, and loving God means loving people. So to be an Ohev Yisrael, a lover of Israel, is to be in love with God. And my talk today is going to discuss some of these traditions. We know that Jewish understandings of philanthropy are rooted in prophetic teachings, teachings about justice and human responsibility, about redemption, about God. And similarly, philanthropy itself, in specific ways, responds to the prophetic insistence on justice and also the prophetic critique of claims of being innocent of sin, disavowal of responsibility that the prophets address, and I'll talk about that. Philanthropy also gives concrete expression to the prophets' insistence that redemption comes through relationships. And finally, I want to talk about Jewish thinkers who read the Bible and come to an understanding of philanthropy theologically, that is, as prayer, as redemption. Judaism, as we know, has two kinds of commandments between a human being and another human being, and between the human being and God. In some ways, philanthropy covers both and brings them together. I want to explore these different examples with some of the texts. We know, for example, that the word tzedakah, which can be translated as charity, as donation, used as philanthropy, the translation is of righteousness. Righteousness is a special word. It's the word that we hope in Judaism describes our own lives. This is a righteous person, an ish tzaddik. A righteous person, that's what we're supposed to aspire to become. We're commanded, of course, in the Bible to pursue justice. A famous phrase, tzedek tirdof, pursue justice. And we're also promised justice once we achieve redemption. One of the most common verses in the Bible is, remember that you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Repeated over and over in the Bible, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the soul of the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. A passage that's especially pressing on our minds as Jews these days with the upcoming Passover holiday next week. A holiday that on the one hand speaks about liberation from enslavement in Egypt, and on the other hand points out that liberation has not yet come. Redemption we still wait for. The word tzedakah implies benevolence, kindness, but also compassion. And my father, who was a Jewish theologian, Abraham Joshua Heschel, used to say to me, if there's one word that defines Judaism, it's compassion, rachmanos. When we give tzedakah, charity, philanthropy, we actually shouldn't think that we have gone above and beyond the call of duty. Rather, we're giving because we're simply fulfilling the demands of justice all around us. We've done the right thing. This belief is based on the concept that everything we possess is in fact a gift from God. And God has specified that we should share our gifts with other people. And surely then if we share the gift from God, we can't say, oh, I've done something so extraordinary. We've simply done what is morally right. So justice doesn't exist simply because it's a nice idea. Justice is what we pursue to be the kind of human being that we want to become. And justice is the foundation, then, of philanthropy, because it is the creation to make the world that God envisions. Justice isn't simply correct, and justice here means philanthropy, charity. Justice is the beating heart of Judaism, of Christianity, of Islam. One might say metaphorically, the beating heart of God. For the prophets, the ultimate expression of God, the ultimate metaphor, is actually not wisdom or magnificence or land or glory, not even love, but rather justice. The prophet Isaiah says that Zion shall be redeemed by justice, and those who repent by righteousness. What do we learn? Justice is the tool of God, the manifestation of God, the means of our redemption. But we also learn that justice is the redemption of God from human mendacity. When we think about philanthropy, immediately Jewish thinkers turn to the famous medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides, great philosopher, rabbi, physician, ethicist, codifier of Jewish law. We think of him because he spoke about levels of charity. There are levels, ways to do it. And for Maimonides, one of the great levels of charity is to make someone else not to be in need of charity, to make them independent, to donate in a way that enables people to stand on their own, to achieve their dreams, to advance their lives, to endow college scholarships, to build job training centers, to create libraries, medical care for the health of bodies, houses of worship for the health of the soul, child care so that families can participate in society. The highest priority is often thought to be giving anonymously, responding to someone's needs without being asked, yes, but we also have to think about what it means to give in relationship. What's interesting to me is that so many Jewish thinkers speak about not only the act of giving, but the manner in which we give. That is, that we have to give generously and with a smile, warmly. And indeed, the generosity of spirit, we're told in the Talmud, is as important as the generosity of money. In the Talmud, Rabbi Elazar says, tzedakah, charity, is only measured according to the kindness by which it is performed. And this he takes based on a verse from the prophet Hosea. Plant for them with tzedakah, with charity, with justice, and reap according to kindness. The code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, states, one must give tzedakah with a pleasant countenance, with joy, and with a good heart, empathizing with the plight of the receiver, offering words of comfort. If one gives with a sad face, then he's lost the benefit of giving. Another text, a midrash Avot de Rabbi Natan, says, greet every person you meet with a pleasant countenance, and then asks, what does that mean? It means that even if a person gives someone the most precious gifts in the world, but does so with a gloomy, sour face, then the Torah considers it as if he gave nothing. But one who greets friends with a pleasant countenance, with a smile, with joy, that person is considered to have given the best gifts in the world, even if he didn't give any gifts at all. It's the generosity of spirit. Philanthropy is also conveying warmth, compassion, love, joy. Now we might ask, why do people offer philanthropy? I think we would conclude that there is indeed an impulse to generosity in every person. Religions offer motivations. They tell us we have to give, and they motivate us. They suggest rewards. You'll go to heaven in the afterlife. You'll get recognition from your community. Recognition, honor. I want to just tell you something. Because we're entering spring now, and you know, every week, starting in the fall, we read a section of the Pentateuch. And in the spring, we come to that section of the Pentateuch in the book of Leviticus that happens to have been my bat mitzvah parsha, one of the most boring parshas you can imagine. It's the parsha called Emor, think E-M-O-R, Emor. But it so happens that there's something wonderful about this parsha, and I love this, There was a tradition in Eastern Europe that on that parsha, that week in the synagogue, when that is read, the community would call up to the Torah to be honored the water carriers, the people who had the most menial jobs, the people who were the poorest in the community, in the village. Why? The word for a water pail in Yiddish is emmer, and it sounds like emor. And so that parsha now has a special significance for me, and I hope for all of us, to think that perhaps there should also be a week when we honor those who may not have the means to give philanthropically with money, but who give us what we need to be alive, water, and who do so generously. I hope it's a tradition that can be revived in Jewish life. But the emphasis in the discussions of tzedakah in Jewish texts is the importance of conveying dignity to the recipient. Very important point. Understandings of human dignity always inform philanthropy. But what is human dignity? On the one hand, we all know, and every religion will say, human beings are born with an innate sense of dignity. It belongs to us from birth that we are people of dignity. But I think it's not so simple, because actually when we think about it, dignity is something that we convey. And in conveying dignity to others, we create our own dignity. If you think, for example, when somebody dies, the body is never to be left alone. Someone stays with the body, recites psalms. The body is washed and covered and buried. We convey dignity to a dead body. The dead body doesn't know what we're doing, but we become people of dignity by conveying dignity. That's very important. And that's true too in philanthropy. A person who gives, a person who receives, in a sense, both are both. Both are receiving, both are giving. One to the other. Now we know that philanthropy, we encourage sometimes, Maimonides encourage, give it anonymously so you don't embarrass someone. And we understand that people can be embarrassed if the fact that they're needy comes to public knowledge. But we also know that there's some people who need more than money, shelter, food. They need a relationship. And so there is also the need in philanthropy for intimacy. Intimacy, in fact, in religion, and certainly in Judaism, it's as important as Jewish law, as halakha, intimacy. Where is intimacy found, and what makes intimacy religious? First of all, when we pray. When we pray, we have an opportunity that we offer our soul to find its home. For us to find our soul, for our soul to find us, for our soul to find God. But intimacy also comes by recognizing what someone needs and responding, just as we respond to God's need of us. Now that may sound strange. Why would God need us? Aristotle told us that God is the unmoved mover. And yet what we find in the Bible is that God is full of passion, warmth and love and anger and forgiveness. There's an emotional subjectivity to God. This is called in Rabbinic Judaism, tzorach gavoha, a divine need, that God needs us. What does God need from us? There's a prayer, a very common prayer in Judaism called Kaddish, prayer that, for example, is recited when someone dies. Kaddish doesn't have the name of God, doesn't mention God, but it speaks about magnifying holiness. Magnifying holiness, magnifying God's presence in the world. That is responding to God's need to be present with us. Maimonides does suggest that we create a relationship with the person who is donating and who receives our donation. For some people, intimacy is very appreciated. For some, no, they don't want. Fine. But the intimacy of philanthropy can also be considered a moment of prayer, a moment of intimacy with God, of sensing God's presence, of knowing that this is part of creating the kind of world that God wants. Perhaps I might quote one of your colleagues here at Indiana University, whom I don't know, but I've read, Alexandra Hudson. She writes about the importance of civility, respecting and loving someone, she writes, respecting and loving someone enough to tell a hard truth and engaging in robust debate, but doing so in a way that doesn't leave your opponent feeling bad. How I behave, that is, depends on how I make other people feel. Justice uplifts human personality and it affirms human dignity, while unjust laws and behaviors corrode human personality, degrade personhood and human dignity. Perhaps I might here quote my father, who said, "We will not perish as human beings for lack of information, but we may perish for lack of appreciation." Is there a reward for philanthropy? In the Bible, in the book of Proverbs, we read, "Treasures of wickedness will not avail, but tzedakah will save us from death." And another verse, "Riches will not avail on the day of wrath, but tzedakah will save from death." What does that mean? Acts of charity will protect against death? Why does giving to others philanthropically protect from death? Well, we might consider that when we do an act of philanthropy, we're creating something that will live beyond our lives, that will have life with other people eternally. I want to turn for a moment in the last part of my talk to some theological reflections. And I turn first to this question of how great charity is that it has the ability to save us from death, in an interpretation that comes from someone known as the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Israel Meir Kagan. What does it mean, this verse in Proverbs? He says, when a person gives charity in this world, his intention is that the funds will enable other people to live and live well. It says in a midrash, "Your charity will go before you. The glory of God will gather you in." It's a verse from Isaiah. That is, when a person dies who has given charity, who has done good deeds, his charity and his good deeds march in front of him as he goes up to heaven. They intercede before God on his behalf, and they don't let prosecuting angels denounce him. That's the meaning of the verse in Job. If he has with him a defending angel, one of 1,000, he will tell the person's virtues. The good that we do in this world is with us even after death. Now, of course, we know that human responsibility is the central message of the Hebrew prophets. We stand with the weak, the marginal, the oppressed. The prophets speak about widows and orphans. The prophets challenge the figures of power, and they identify also and expose the disavowal and the claims to innocence and ignorance that structure and maintain the power of oppression. It's this claim of innocence that the prophet Jeremiah denounces. He speaks directly to this issue of disavowal, I am innocent. He says, quote, "On your shirt is found the lifeblood of the guiltless poor. Yet in spite of these things you say, I am innocent. Behold, I will bring you to judgment for saying, I have not sinned." We know this here in the United States and in so many other countries. We know about ignorance and innocence, those who do not want to know, those who disavow what they already know, about injustice, about poverty, about mendacity. It becomes a form of evasions. We keep our sins hidden. But philanthropy counters disavowal. It recognizes what's needed and addresses those needs that are all around us. Justice refers to the fulfillment of the basic demands around us, the demands that society is based on. There are acts of tzedakah that go beyond all that is required in a basic way because they promote a refinement of our character, our morality, a demand that we aspire to something more. And so tzedakah is rooted in tzedek, charity and justice. Scripture says, in referring to returning a pledge to a poor debtor, it shall be considered as tzedakah for you, in Deuteronomy. We have in the central prayer of Judaism, the Shema, we said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your, and the word is odecha. What does that mean? With all your muchness? What is that? Some say it refers to all of our gifts. Love God with our gifts. How do we love God? We give to others. The Midrash records a dialogue, an imagined dialogue based on a verse in the Psalms, this verse that says, "So I will sing praise unto your name forever." And the Midrash, the commentary, asks, how do we sing such praise forever, praise of God? Forever? Through tzedakah. King David said to God, "Why don't you make your world equal? Why must there be such a huge economic disparity between rich and poor?" And the Midrash says, God said to King David, "If I make all people equal, who will practice kindness and charity?" It's a little iffy. I would have preferred the other. But I understand what God wants of us. The mitzvah, the commandment, is not simply to give, but to promote economic justice, to be part of God's plan for this world. Now, justice is God's order of the world and of human relationships. And there's an amazing passage, interpretation of a passage in the book of Deuteronomy. The verses go like this, Deuteronomy 15. "If there is among you anyone in need, a member of your community, in any of your towns, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted. You should rather open your hand." Open your hand. I looked at some of the commentaries on that verse and that phrase, open your hand. What does that mean? Open your hand is understood in some of these Jewish commentaries as a reference to both human beings and to God. I'll give you some examples. Nachman of Bratslav, a Hasidic Rebbe in Eastern Europe in the early modern period, speaks about philanthropy as creating new beginnings. The way he understands it, philanthropy transforms heartlessness into compassion. In other words, it's not that we first become generous and then give, but the act of giving gives us generosity. It transforms us. And he bases this on a wonderful verse. When ravens, this is in 1 Kings, feed the prophet Elijah. What's startling about that? Ravens, this bird, the raven, he says, are actually not friendly birds. He says they're cruel birds. And yet, giving food to Elijah changed them. That is, giving is a way of transforming us from indifference to empathy. Nachman goes on to talk about philanthropy as a painful process. He says we begin, and he writes this, he says we begin with, oy vey, this is hard, with resistance. He compares philanthropy to childbirth. It's painful. It's painful, childbirth, and so is philanthropy, Nachman says. The two are analogous, he says. Why? They both involve opening. Opening. An opening of a woman's body to bring forth a new life. And true devotion to God, he says, is the same. Opening. It begins with this verse in Deuteronomy. Open your hand. To begin to worship God, he says, one needs to make an opening to this new path of life. All beginnings are difficult because in beginning, you have to break through and open a new entrance. Tzedakah, philanthropy, he says, is the beginning of all beginnings because it opens and widens all the entrances into this world. And yet, he says, the remarkable power of philanthropy, of tzedakah, is that it can widen an opening, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of others. It creates the possibility of new birth. When we create an opening through devotion to God and philanthropy, he writes, tzedakah itself opens and widens because it's the beginning of beginnings. It widens all entrances. It widens our entry into God. So, in other words, that phrase, open your hand, alludes to the opening of our lives. And it's through tzedakah that we open ourselves to becoming people of righteousness. But there's another commentary. Another rabbi, Tzedakah Cohen, commented also on this verse, open your hand, explaining that charity and piety are similar experiences. And he uses the Exodus from Egypt as the metaphor, as the example. He says, in the beginning, a person's entry into God's service should be quick, like the Exodus from Egypt, quickly. That's why we have matzah. We had no time to let the dough rise. We had matzah. It was eaten in a hurry. Why? He says, it's hard for people to become religious, to become pious, to pray. Even a religious person at times finds it hard. And yet, we have to detach ourselves, liberate ourselves from our everyday engagements at times and moments. Requires attentiveness to the moment that arouses God's will that we should pray. We have to hurry in that moment to detach ourselves from worldliness and worldly desires. But after that moment, he says, then yes, we can walk with moderation. He says, to begin to open a person to the worship of God, one has to be in a hurry, as it was with leaving Egypt. There's a moment when people feel inspired to be generous, to give philanthropically, a moment of awakening, like the moment when the Israelites fled Egypt. But after a while, a short while, that moment of inspiration may pass. Just as the Israelites, after they left Egypt, you know what they said, we missed the food, let's go back. That happens. The moment of generosity is wonderful. But tzedakah, philanthropy, charity, justice, has to be regulated because these moments are too rare and too fleeting. There are moments of inspiration, of wonder, of awe, of radical amazement. When we're filled with the joy of God's presence, it's palpable. Moments when we realize, and I quote my father, that just to be is a blessing. Just to live is holy. Such moments may be fleeting, but we have to cultivate those moments and we have to remember them. And that's really what religion is about. There are, of course, many passages in Jewish texts about what tzedakah can do for us. But then there's the question of what tzedakah can do for God. And now I turn to Menachem Mendel of Kosov, the founder of Visionitz Hasidism, another great Hasidic Rebbe from Eastern Europe. And he also commented, and I love this comment, about open your hand. What does that mean? So this is a sort of a play in Hebrew on the word hand, your hand. He says, the verse is open your hand, yadecha. But he says, no, think of it, and he's actually here quoting a passage in the Zohar from the 13th century, a Jewish mystical text. But it's a wonderful pun. He says it's not your hand, yadecha, but yodecha, that is your yuds, your letter yud. It's a little letter in Hebrew, like the letter I, a little letter. Don't read it as your hand, read it as your yuds. What does that mean? It's a reference to God, the name of God. Shem Havaya and Adonai, these two names of God that appear, two of the names, and that's what it is. Not just open your hand, but open these two names of God. When these two names of God are opened, then all sources of blessing and goodness and healing are opened, he said. Giving tzedakah, that moment of passing the wealth from one human hand to another, also has the power to open the hand of God, he says, the source of all blessing. Because what we bring to life through philanthropy lives beyond our death, giving us eternal life on earth and giving new life to those who receive. Now, I want to conclude by just saying that I recognize, of course, as we all do, that we're living in a difficult era. We're living at a time of very widespread loneliness, anomie, conflict, cynicism. And I would even say that there is in our society a tenor of sadism, sadistic meanness, cruelty. And so, in such a time, it's not easy to find a spirit of generosity that's going to encourage people to be philanthropic. Philanthropy is the opposite of cynicism, selfishness, sadism. And yet, of course, our needs are great, not only for the philanthropy of financial funding, but also for the philanthropy of our time, the time of our life. Life is time, of the giving of ourselves, with ideas, with relationships, with arousing support from others, from arousing joy and kindness within others, human kindness and compassion. And yet, we have to say that the United States is unique in its attentiveness to the prophetic tradition. I don't find the same kind of attention to the Hebrew prophets in the writings that come from other countries, theological writings. The prophetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible and the interpretations of rabbinic and later Judaism, some of which I presented today, offer us ways to think about ourselves, our neighbors, our theology. But ultimately, philanthropy is a relationship with oneself, between one person and another, between communities, but also between ourselves and God. Philanthropy is offered to help one another, but it must always be with generosity of spirit, with a smile, with kindness. Philanthropy is a tikkun, a repair of broken aspects of our society. And in that way, tzedakah, philanthropy, becomes a path to redemption. Philanthropy, as I've presented, is also understood as generosity toward God, giving strength to God, creating more of God's presence in this world. Can philanthropy be understood as prayer? Like religious devotion, philanthropy may begin with a moment of inspiration, a burst of generous spirit. Faith rests on these moments, and yet these moments may be fleeting. They require cultivation, remembrance, guidance, and concretization. That's why we have religion, in Judaism, halakha. It's why we have religious holidays and celebrations. And that's why we have educational institutions and houses of worship. As we open our hearts, we open God's heart. We create more of God's presence in this world. And through philanthropy, we make ourselves worthy of redemption. Finally, philanthropy, it seems to me, is about justice, relationships, prayer, and redemption. Our redemption from injustice and God's redemption from the selfishness and mendacity that limit God's presence in our world. May it be our ability to recognize what we are needed by one another and also from God. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Susannah, for a wonderful, I would say, pushing us to see conceptually how philanthropy fits into our practices and our lives and opens up our minds to these great reflections. And thinking about, you illustrated this in so many ways, but could you say anything more about how our religious traditions, or the Jewish tradition particularly, sort of opens up this broader language and conceptualization of how we think about philanthropy? You illustrated it, but what are some of the strengths from within our traditions and practices that kind of help us open up what we're talking about with philanthropy and generosity of spirit?
You know, I'm struck that some of the texts that I quoted from the East European Jewish tradition, from Poland, from a world that no longer exists, but those were traditions that were created by rabbis who lived in villages, and in villages where people did in fact know each other and cared for each other. In those days, it was mostly women who organized groups, a small group, to attend to different kinds of needs. It would be a group that would bring food to someone who was sick, or another group that would bring financial aid to someone who was impoverished, or create a wedding for an orphan, and so on. So I think there was something very concrete and very human and very immediate, very present when it came to what we call philanthropy in those days. And that, I'm sure, stimulated these rabbis to think in deeper ways about what it means to give of oneself, whether one gives financially or gives through visiting someone who's ill. That's also a love that is given to human beings, which is philanthropy.
And you mentioned earlier on, it's maybe not so much what we give, but how we give.
Yes.
Can you say anything more about that? Sort of like really focused in on the how.
So I actually love that. I found I hadn't known about this before, but that one has to give with a smile, with joy, and otherwise it's not giving, doesn't count. And I think that's great. I think that's an important lesson. You don't give grudgingly. Oh, you know, yet again, I have to write a check to this charity, let's say. But with joy. And because, of course, it's the joy that one conveys to another person that can be so deeply meaningful. And I appreciate that, because it's really true, isn't it? If someone gives you something with a scowl, of course it's not the same.
And this is a question you hit on throughout, but it's a big question. Who is philanthropy for? Is it for the recipient, us, God?
Well, yes, that's for whom do we, why? Well, it seems so central, first of all. It's so central in religion, in all religions. So for what purpose then? I wonder, could we, for example, could we still call ourselves, this may sound a little heretical, so I hope the rabbis here won't mind, but could we call ourselves religious if we don't pray but we give charity? Would that be sufficient? I wonder, because in a way it is so important. It is so central. So for whose we give for the person who receives, but we're also giving for ourselves, and we're also giving for God. But not for our self-aggrandizement, although there's nothing wrong with feeling good about giving. One should. And to be honored for it, absolutely. There's nothing wrong with that. But we should also honor those like the water carriers, yeah? So yes, it's on so many levels. I'm giving to someone, and I'm also at the same time giving to God as if it were my prayers.
Do you think that might be unique? I mean, I think the strengths of some of our religious traditions, where you really highlighted the relational capacity and sort of the vertical plane along with the horizontal plane. I mean, that seems like a distinct, really, addition, thinking about the way that many people give because of building relationships, both in response to God, but also in relationship with each other.
Yes, yeah. So, yes, there's a line that my father has, prayer may not save us, but it may make us worthy of being saved. So giving may not save us, but it may make us worthy. And that's what rings in my ear.
And you thought about, helped us think about philanthropy as prayer, and sort of making that connection point. Unpack that a bit more for us. How do you kind of see those practices maybe connected in some way, or metaphorically even?
Yes. So we have prayer through words, of course. We have prayer of the heart, the devotion, which may be wordless prayer. We also have prayer in the form of a deed, of an act that I do. Is it not a prayer if I give joy to someone who is desolate? Isn't that also then a form of prayer? And I think that's what's being emphasized when we're told, when you give, do it with a smile. Do it with a spirit of generosity, with joy. And so then the act itself becomes a giving that is a form, prayer in the form of a deed.
We had one question come in when we asked for some questions and feedback ahead of the lecture, and one key question was focusing on the is there a necessity for community? So is it something about that we share together within a particular community? What about just a shared humanity? But what is the value of community as you've explored it within the Jewish tradition for forgiving, or that relational, thinking about the relational capacities you mentioned?
Well, I actually did come across, there's a lot of discussion in Jewish texts about where our obligation lies. Do I give to my family first and then my larger community? What about people I don't even know, and so on? Where should I have these priorities? And there's a lot of debate about that, which one could read. But but clearly, when you give, you do form relationship in the giving. It becomes reciprocal, and you make a community in that sense. I don't think community, the word, requires 10 people, 20 people, and so on. I can be in a community with one other person because we share something, an understanding, experiences. I'm sure we all have that. We have friends with whom we have a particular conversation that may be different than we have with a different friend. So there is a community in that sense. What is my obligation to my community? And that's the question we ask. I'm afraid that sometimes there are those in our cynical world who feel that the community is there to give to me and not me to give to them. And that's a concern. And that's why the emphasis has to be over and over again on the generosity, on the philanthropy, on the charity, on the tzedakah, and the importance, the centrality of it. That shapes the kind of person that I can then become. Can I, for instance, I'll just tell you, I observed something growing up. I would sometimes accompany my father to the grocery store or to some shop, and every now and then there would be a clerk who was in a bad mood. And I think that most people respond when a clerk in a store is not friendly, very unfriendly. People sometimes will respond in kind. They'll be unfriendly to the clerk. But what I learned from my father was that what is in fact a religious obligation? You meet a clerk who's in a bad mood, who's scowling, who may say something rude, and your obligation is to try to help that person turn the scowl into a smile. What can you say? What can you do to reach out, to be warm, to be friendly, to say something that will change the mood? That too is philanthropy. That is a kind of generosity that says, I am going to suppress my instinct to respond in kind and scowl back, and instead, I'm going to say, well, how can I give tzedakah in this moment?
That reminds me of your notion around sort of alluding to creation and thinking often as we might think of philanthropy as sort of a zero-sum game. Like I have resources and I give them to you. But in some sense, you're saying that no, there's a kind of a snowball effect that can happen. I mean, it transforms not only maybe a beneficiary, but in relationship, it transforms you, and then it makes a community better. It makes a neighborhood better. I think that's really helpful to think about the sort of the transformation that philanthropy can bring about as a practice for all of us.
And actually, I would say, yes, it is about transformation, absolutely, and I'm glad you said that word, because that's also what an example with the scowling clerk in the store or something. But in a sense, I would say, that's what I observed when I was a child and I met some of the Hasidic rabbis who had gotten out of Europe and came to the United States. These were elderly people, but there was something where I felt transformed to be in their presence. I have to say, when I went to college and we read books about the nature of the holy, Rudolf Otto, the idea of the holy and all of that stuff, I just kept quiet, but I thought, they don't know what they're talking about. I knew. Now, what do I mean by that? I felt myself transformed in that moment. There are moments in our lives when we may encounter someone whom we experience as holy, or where we may have an experience that transforms us, that we are different. Now, then the question is, are we the recipients in that moment of something extraordinary that is coming to us? But there's also the response. That is, then it becomes also my obligation, if I want to call myself a religious person, to help transform other people, to take their sarcasm or cynicism or their misery and loneliness and try to transform them, to give to them, to be transformative, so that philanthropy isn't just for the moment. It's something that can change in an eternal way. And so too, if I can change someone's mood from misery to happy, then I've changed their life. And that will come forward in their life as well. Just as I can be transformed in a living way forever from certain experiences that I've had, that I carry with me.
Well, I'm struck by the transfer. We all have these transformational experiences. These kind of breaking points where we're different as we move through. We've encountered someone else. We've had this experience, and then you're pointing to how we need to then move towards the regular practices of spreading what we've and kind of continue to develop that sense of the broad notion of philanthropy you mentioned. So to get practical, I think all of us probably have these different kinds of practices. But what are a couple of the kind of regular types of practices that you might encourage us to think through in order to grow in our generosity of spirit? We're going to write these down so we make sure.
Well, I think that we have sometimes, I find, at least maybe it's people in my generation, I don't know, who don't like regularity and rules. They rebel against them. They want everything to be spontaneous. When the moment moves me, I'll do it. But not because I have to. Don't tell me I have to do this every day or every week and so on. And that's too bad. I would say that the regularity that religion prescribes for us at times can feel confining, but at times it can also give us the possibility of that moment of inspiration. I'll tell you, I think actually having a day every week, the Sabbath, for those who can observe a day, even just an evening, but having that moment in my life, I would recommend. I think it's wonderful. I think it's a moment for so many gifts of reflection, of prayer, of family, and also of generosity. I have to take Friday off and go to the grocery store and clean the house and cook the dinner. And I serve my food to my family. I want them sitting there and I serve them. I want the act of giving people food, my family, my friends at the table with blessings. That's important to me. That's a gift to them that makes it's a gift to me to be able to do that.
Well, I think one thing that we oftentimes make sure to instill in our students and those that we're engaged with at the School of Philanthropy is most of us don't know how to spell philanthropy, much less exactly who a philanthropist is. And when we see sometimes a philanthropist, we have a particular image in our mind of who that might look like. And in some ways, you're thinking about those in our lives who care for us, who bring us a hot meal, who have that relational capital with us. I mean, how much you kind of push forward with your general notion of generosity of spirit. Who are the philanthropists in your life in that way that you can sort of illustrate for us and put a picture in our mind of those types of people?
I would say for me and I imagine for most of us, there's a wide range of people who inspire and give us that moment of enormous joy, that gift. And I think we find it in different ways. I think when I go to a lecture that I really love, that gives me a new way of thinking about history or literature, I love that. I feel euphoric. I felt euphoric when I was a freshman in college and took a class on Hebrew Bible. And I remember bicycling to class and thinking, I am euphoric. I thought, this must be what it's like to smoke marijuana. And I don't need marijuana. I've got this wonderful seminar.
I'm sure that's how everybody had thought of it.
So, yes, yes, and there are friends. There's the experience of being understood by someone, of being comforted. These moments, but these are moments of intimacy, of relationship. And then there comes the question, and I'll just say, there was one day when I was a kid and I was doing my homework, and it suddenly occurred to me, something amazing. I thought to myself, you know what? I have a life. I can do what I want. I can study what I want. I can become it's mine, not my parents. And it was just an amazing moment of revelation. And I immediately went to my father and I told him, this is my life. And he said to me, yes, but what are you going to do with it? And that's, I think, the question. So we have these great moments, great people, great relationships, moments of inspiration. What are we going to do with it? And that's the question. And I think that's what philanthropy is about. What are we going to do with our lives, with all that we've accumulated, both spiritually, morally, but also financially? What are we going to do?
You highlighted for us sort of the growth in maybe isolation, loneliness, polarization, in some sense talked about the relational nature of philanthropy. But to turn that around, could the practices of philanthropy be the medicine that we might need to build community and build relationships, almost kind of reversing that? Is that a practice that we could kind of instill in the young and old and everybody in between?
So isn't philanthropy something that one cultivates in one's children, one's family? That this is how we are in the world. This is our obligation, that life isn't just what comes to us, but what are you going to do with it? So yes, in that sense. And then the joy of it. It's not obligation and like homework. It's joy, the opportunity to give, the opportunity to endow, the opportunity to have this eternal gift for so many people. And I think every single person has benefited from philanthropy in so many different ways. In each of our lives, we've been shaped. Of course, whether it's going to a college or a summer camp or a hospital, all of us.
You made a strong case for the prophetic tradition and highlighted how that also makes the case for relational philanthropy. Where do you see that prophetic tradition? You pointed to the how the U.S. has sort of at least in theological or biblical scholarship, has leaned in some of that prophetic tradition. But how do you see that today, or how have you sort of draw some of those threads for us about how that has impacted the way you see the work that you do?
Well, of course, when I was growing up, there was a civil rights movement. My father was involved in it, and that's really why I fell in love with the Bible. From my father, Dr. King, other civil rights leaders, I felt also moved, deeply moved, and inspired and exhilarated. And there were certain civil rights leaders I felt were holy human beings, really, truly holy. It was an experience to be in their presence. And much of it came from the training in nonviolence, which I wish could be revived today, because the nonviolence training was not just about don't hit back if someone hits you, and that wasn't it. It was about months and months of trying to learn to become a different kind of a person in how we treat others, how we think about other people. That was what it was about. And so today, I wish we had more of that. It's in our heritage, and I'd like to see it revived. I don't think that we're going to create a society of justice by screaming and mobbing and being angry, and certainly not with the kind of sadistic behavior that so many people engage in, especially on the internet, but also with political rallies. It's nasty. That's destructive to us. When people mock other people, they destroy their own dignity. And the question is, how do we recover it? Can I say something about that?
Please.
Because I came across a wonderful interpretation that I love so much, and Passover's coming next week, so I just mentioned this. So everybody knows the famous verse in chapter 10, verse 1 of the book of Exodus, where God says to Moses, "Bo'el Paro ki ichbadati et libo," come to Pharaoh, because the quote, the translation, the common translation is, "Come to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart." Everybody knows that verse, but the commentary says something else, and this is from the Kedushas Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, late 18th century, same, this East European period, doesn't matter. One of my ancestors, by the way. But here's what he says. The word hard in Hebrew has several meanings. Hard can also mean heavy, but it also, kavod, can mean honor, dignity, glory, like kavod Hashem, the glory of God. And he says, in this case, it's not that God made Pharaoh's heart hard. Rather, he says, God made Pharaoh's heart dignified. He gave Pharaoh dignity. He made Pharaoh into a person of dignity. Why does he say that? Because a few verses later, Pharaoh says, "I have sinned." And he says, what does it take for a person to repent? To say, "I have sinned." It's a very hard thing to do. It's so hard to say to somebody, believe me, I know this with my husband, to say to him, "You're right, I was wrong, I'm sorry." Why is that so hard? But what does it take, the commentary goes on, in order to say, "I have sinned"? You have to feel that you are a person of dignity. If someone has mocked you and shamed you and degraded you, how are you going to say to someone, I've sinned, I repent"? No, you can't do that. You don't have it in you. And so, in fact, in order to repent, you have to have a sense of your own dignity. So I find that very striking. How can we in our society today, with all of the anger and the cynicism, with the mockery and the sadism, how do we restore our dignity? Those who mock need their dignity restored. And that, I think, is a big challenge today. How can we do that in our society? And that's not only at the universities with the students. It's going on everywhere. It's not just right wing, it's not just left wing, it's the mood of the country. And it worries me.
I'm going to try that next time with my kids. And typically it's just, say you're sorry, say it like you mean it. But I'm gonna work with the dignity point to bring in. But all kidding aside, I think we're
praise the child. Say
Yeah.
You're so great. You do so well. This is so what, and then see what happens.
okay. All right, I'm gonna wait till I try. I'll write you and let you know how it goes. I think, all kidding aside, I think really you make a wonderful point that one thing that is not only are we belittling the dignity of our opponent, but it hurts our own dignity as well. Well, I could ask you sort of where do you see the prophets today, but even so, where are some of the prophetic voices that you see today, maybe that are not your father or our king? Big names, but really more maybe just the practical everyday. Like where are you looking for the bright spots that you can see some glimmers of hope of where some of that generosity of spirit is finding its way in?
Well, one doesn't have to be a Martin Luther King to be a wonderful human being who is working to make this a better society. And there are many ways, of course, to do that. What I would just say, look, after October 7th at Dartmouth, we held 2 faculty forums. We had 4 faculty in the front of the room. Room was open to everybody, and we had live stream, and there were hundreds and hundreds of students who came. And what we did was simply to create an atmosphere of respect, of calm, of dignity, the way we spoke to each other. And students asked sometimes pretty sharp questions, but they did it respectfully, because I feel, and my colleagues feel, that the university is a special place and deserves our best behavior, a certain way of speaking, a certain way of thinking. We don't speak in the classroom the way we speak when we go out to dinner somewhere. It's special, and we create that as the professors. It's similar if you go to a house of worship. There's a way of behaving and a way of speaking. So I would say if I have some glimmers of hope, it would be that our students understood that, and they went along with us. And they also realized that this kind of interaction, polite, respectful, would benefit them. They would come to learn, to understand. We said that to them. We're here to help you understand. Let's learn together and study. We're not here just to make declarations, grandstand, and we're not here to litigate the past. We're here to think about the future. What do we want to see in 20, 30, 40 years? What are the roadblocks? How do we overcome those roadblocks? What can we do in a concrete way? How can we, as professors, empower you as students to help overcome some of those roadblocks so that we can get to peace? Peace in the Middle East, peace in society. So in that sense, I think it's really a matter not so much of particular arguments or statements or political positions. I think it's about the atmosphere. It's about creating an atmosphere of respect and dignity and kindness and compassion, attentiveness. That's what we need. And those who are able to collaborate in doing that, in the atmosphere in society and how we speak to one another, that's what we need right now.
And my hunch is that you were able to model that in those open forums because you had practiced that relational work over years with your colleagues, and you had that capacity to have tough conversations because you had that trust built in. Is that the assumption, really?
Sure, and because I want to learn. I don't want to teach the same classes every single year. I want to teach new classes. I co-teach with colleagues in Middle Eastern studies. We have a course going on this spring on Arabs, Jews, and Constructions of Modernity. I learned from that Arabs and Jews have very similar experiences in response to the Enlightenment and the course of the 19th century. First enthusiasm and then terrible dismay, but similar problems religiously, politically, culturally, and so forth, and similar response. So this then becomes, all of this is opportunity to learn more, and to learn is thrilling. And I can't learn if I'm insistent on a position that I hold or that I know and no one else does or something like that. The openness has to be there.
Well, to take a phrase from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs around this notion of dignity across difference, across political divides, cultural divides, but maybe religious traditions in particular, because you've done so much work in comparative ways, how can we continue to think about these questions of dignity across our various religious traditions, what we hold in common, and to talk about where we might differ?
Well, I actually worry a bit, and you mentioned Jonathan Sachs, who was very important, remains still to this day an important thinker for many Jews. His interest as an Orthodox rabbi in Great Britain, in engaging in dialogue with the Dalai Lama, for example, with Muslims, with Christians, I have a lot of respect for him for having done that. But the difficulty that remains is the problem of how does someone like Jonathan Sachs, as an Orthodox rabbi, sit down with Jews who are Reform, Reconstructionist, conservative, or not religious at all, which he didn't want to do. So sometimes it seems to me we have the intra-religious dialogue rather than the inter. Yeah? It's easier often for me to talk to somebody of another religion than to talk to some of the people who were Jewish who were,
I think we've seen that across the tradition of this notion of inter or intra. I mean, it's a really great, and sometimes it's easier to have conversations with people what looks like across great difference than within our own family, within our own community, where we have strong differences in that sort of way. I think that's helpful for us. As we conclude tonight, are there any?
But let me just say that it's really important for me that I was raised in a way where I feel comfortable in any synagogue I come into, pretty much. There's some places where women are, it's hard to take. But I want to feel comfortable, and I want my children always to feel comfortable with all different ways of being Jewish, whether it's from Reform to Orthodox, whether it's secular and so on. I want them to feel comfortable. I want them to feel that it's all for them. And they'll see, of course, the problems, as I do, the things I like and don't like. Okay, but I want to feel comfortable, and I want to appreciate what each one is a form of Jewish expression, religious expression, in its own way, and has something to offer me that can be inspiring. And I want to be able to sense that inspiration, to receive it. That's what's important.
I want to just make sure to give you the last word as we're thinking about religious traditions or Jewish traditions. Remind us how significant they are, not for the practice of philanthropy, but what can they teach us? Just remind us what can our religious traditions or the Jewish traditions help us to see about how we think about philanthropy, past and present.
Well, how can religious traditions help us think about philanthropy, past and present? I think that for me, in the preparing the material that I studied for the lecture today, what I found especially important was to think about the parallels between philanthropy and being religious. That is the moment of inspiration that also requires cultivation and some regulation, some concretization. Yeah, religion is like that, philanthropy is like that. So the parallels, I think that the moment of giving with joy is similar to prayer. I don't you can't pray if you've just been angry at someone. You have to give that up. You have to resolve that conflict before you can turn to God. So that's similar for me as well. The joy with which you give philanthropically is similar to the moment of prayer. It's also a way in which you have a sense of knowing what is really important in life. I want to be a person of righteousness. How do I do that? I want to find my soul. I want to know who I am. But there's also a unique quality that is of authenticity. There's another thing, which is that not everybody can be the same, of course. And I don't think we can demand people that. My father talks about this in one of his books. He says, he's quoting the Hasidic Rebbe, the Kotzker Rebbe, and he says, you know, your religion has to be authentic to who you are. You have to know who you are, really know who you are as a person, know your soul. And your religiosity, your practice of religion, is an expression of that authentic self. So you have to go into yourself. You have to really do a lot of self-examination and self-understanding. Sometimes it's rigorous and difficult. You know, I know, well, I can be impatient, I can be this and that. No one's limitation, the problems of my soul. But my father says, you know, you can't be religious like other people, because each person's religious expression has to be authentic and unique, just as each person is unique. To try to be religious like other people, that would be, he said, spiritual plagiarism. Which is a great phrase. And so I think in generosity, in philanthropy, we want to know who we are and know how we can best give expression to who we are, to our commitments, to what's important to us, but also what's important to the world around us. So it's not just, this is what I feel is important for me, but what is important for everyone else. And that's where the righteousness comes in, the justice. What can I do that will make me give to this community in a just way, so that I become a person of righteousness?
Well, for the breadth and the depth of the way that you shared with us, just opening up the parallel ideas around religion and philanthropy, I think you really challenged us to open up our minds and inspired us to get to work, to do this. And so I really am grateful for the way that you've really jumped into this kind of interesting topic on faith and philanthropy so willingly, and we are the beneficiaries. So please help me to thank Dr. Susannah Heschel. And we are grateful for those of you who've joined us online, and for those of you who are here, and I'd love to invite you, if you're able to stay, for a brief reception out there to get to know one another, to hear each other's stories. And we were really grateful for the chance for you to join us here from the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving and the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. So thank you so much.